Welcome. If you're a woman who has a sense that there's more out there for you, you're in the right place. I'm Whitney Baker, host of the Electric Ideas podcast. Somewhere along the line of work and kids, life carried on, but I lost track of my truth. I'm on a reflective journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. Each week, I interview a woman who is lighting her own path and offering others hope. Before our conversation ends, we'll share a reflective question for you to explore. Sometimes all we need is a jolt, a fresh idea, an aha moment that connects us to a sense of possibility. This, my friends, is what I call an electric idea. Welcome back to Electric Ideas. I'm your host, Whitney Baker. Today, I am excited to welcome Lisa Marchiano to the show. Lisa is an award-winning author and Jungian analyst. She's published 3 books, but for today, we are focused on her book called Vital Spark: Reclaim Your Outlaw Energies and Find Your Feminine Fire. Lisa is also co-creator and co-host of the popular depth psychology podcast called The Jungian Life, as well as a social worker with a private practice in Philadelphia. Today, we dig deep into the power of reclaiming some of these more fiery aspects of ourselves that many of us are conditioned to tame or conceal. I know this is going to be a thought-provoking conversation for you with many takeaways, so let's get into it. Hi, Lisa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So in your book, Vital Spark, which I thoroughly enjoyed, you posit that within every woman lies a powerful force, but that often the burdens of responsibility and for us mothers out there, that pull to nurture causes that fire to dim. I'm wondering when this pattern became super clear to you.
Well, I think the book is really rooted in my own struggles, I would say. So I noticed that it was difficult for me sometimes to be assertive or to really hold my authority. It's been a bit of a lifetime project stepping into all of that. And the women that I would see in my practice, I'm a Jungian psychoanalyst, would come in and they would tell stories. And I would think, that sounds kind of like what I've been going through, but I don't want to put my own stuff on other people. So I'd sort of offer it very tentatively. I would sort of say, well, could it, is it kind of like this? And they would say, oh, yes. And I started to think, oh, okay, so I'm onto something. This is pretty common. I don't think it's universally true for all women, but I do think that many women have trouble claiming what I've called in this book their outlaw energies.
I agree. And I think that as we talk through a handful, at least, of the outlaw energies, I think some are going to cause pause for certain women and maybe not others. So there might be some that strike certain people. It struck me that this socialization starts when we're girls. And I feel like when we're little, many girls are praised for that air quote, being good or well-behaved or agreeable, perhaps scolded for being loud or, not going with the flow. And some of us get socialized out of our fire, our feistiness, these outlaw qualities. What happens in adulthood when we're disconnected from these pieces of ourselves?
One of the things that I say in the beginning of the book is that there's certain qualities like kindness and nurturance and warmth that help us get and stay connected to other people, which is clearly very important. But there are other qualities like assertiveness and boldness and authority that can help us get and stay connected to ourselves. So I think sometimes if we've really done a good job of developing those first qualities, we're really good at meeting other people's needs, at knowing what other people want. Generally, we're well liked if we're that kind of person, but we might have difficulty knowing what we want. If we do know what we want, we might feel terribly guilty about asking for it or asserting our needs in any way. And we might not be very good about sort of stepping into the fray a little bit and, fighting for ourselves when that's appropriate.
Yes. And you also talk a little bit about how that can bubble up with anger or a feeling of overwhelming selfishness if we're trying to step into our own needs and desires. Have you seen resentment or some of these other things bubble up in your clients who maybe have overemphasized? Because I do want to step back. I think we both agree that nurturing and loving, and those are wonderful qualities, but
Extremely important.
sometimes along the line, yeah, they give tons of meaning to my life, but somewhere along the line for many of us, there becomes this overemphasizing of that versus, and I feel like your argument is this and.
Exactly. Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist who was, kind of colleagues with Freud at the beginning of the 20th century, and then they kind of went their separate ways. But, one of the things that Jung said over and over again is that the goal of growth and development is wholeness, not perfection. He was really interested in bringing in everything. If you've got this, that's great, keep it, but also bring in this. So it's definitely both and. But you were talking about resentment, and I think that one of the things that can happen is, these qualities, for example, anger. I mean, we all have it. And pretending like we don't have it or shoving it away or disallowing it, it actually doesn't make it go away. It makes it kind of disappear and get cramped in a corner where it just kind of builds up a head of steam. So, yes, I mean, I know for myself personally, and also a lot of women in my practice, they can feel a great deal of resentment or they can burst out in kind of uncontrolled rages because they don't have a good relationship with their own anger, which is not an easy thing to do. But I suppose I'm advocating in the book for accept your anger, get curious about it, make friends with it. It's there for a good reason, and it can even be very helpful, even though sometimes it feels kind of frightening and destructive.
I think it's kind of that idea of sacred anger, like giving it a space to listen instead of shoving it under the rug, like you said.
Because if you honor it, it's less likely to drive your life from the back seat.
One thing that made me angry when I was reading the book, this is just an anecdote. Many anecdotes from your personal life were powerful, but I want to take you back to a time when you were just standing, I think it was in college, with a group of mixed company, men and women, and the men were kind of celebrating some wins, let's say, and the women were being coy. And then one guy stopped and kind of, well, tell us what happened. I
So my memory is, so I'm in college and a group of us are standing around and the guys are kind of, I don't know, they're kind of bragging a little bit about the paper that they wrote or the fellowship that they got or the thing they're going to apply for. And I noticed that none of the women present were saying anything. And one of the men turned to me and he said, "How are you doing?" And then he grabbed my wrist and he put his hand around my wrist. He goes, "Wow, you've gotten so thin." Something like that. And I thought, oh, there it is. Men are praised for being big, and women are praised for being small.
I was very frustrated for you in that moment. And I know you mentioned in the book that it's kind of cliche that men are threatened by accomplished, intelligent women and that we're conditioned out of standing in our power. What advice do you have for women who self-select to shrink in these type of environments?
There can be a strategic reason to shrink. And I think I tried to be very careful about throughout the book. There are different strategies that you can choose in any situation. There's usually not just one that's right. One of the things that happens to us is that we usually kind of make it to adulthood with a pretty narrow range of behavioral responses to situations like this. And I think our goal should be to expand our range. So you might be in that situation, say at work in a corporate environment, something similar, and you might decide, given who's here, given the givens, probably the best thing to do is smile and nod. And if it's done consciously and sort of as a strategic choice, that's great. That is a kind of empowerment that you had that choice to make and then you could make it. But I would hope that you'd also have the option, if it felt right, to figure out how to stand up and maybe toot your own horn. And so, how to do that, it's really hard if we're not used to doing it, if we've been taught that doing so is unseemly. One of the things that I think can make a difference is to have an intentional practice of celebrating your own wins. There are different ways to do this. I once read some advice to get a little notebook, and anytime someone gives you a really sincere, important compliment, write it in the notebook. And then you just have this kind of catalog of appreciation that people expressed. Not like, "Oh, I like your blouse," but someone said, "You said something to me the other week and it really helped me," or something like that, something that feels, substantive. But I also think it's a good idea when you've had an accomplishment We tend to ruminate. This is just human nature. We tend to ruminate or perseverate or hang on to negative things that have happened to us, and we think about them a lot. Failures, disappointments, humiliations. But there's also such a thing as positive rumination. If you've had a win, if you did a really good job on a project, or the boss was really pleased with something that happened, or you wrote a really excellent paper and were commended for it, or you won an award, I encourage people to ruminate on that. Think back to it throughout the day. Think, wow, that is so great. I did this thing. Just to yourself a little bit. Just enjoy it. Just enjoy it. And then I think having an intentional celebration of it. It might just be, I'm going to leave work an hour early and go for a walk. And that's going to be the way I celebrate this thing that I did. Maybe it's opening a bottle of champagne, but whatever it is, it's your own little ritual to acknowledge it. You don't even have to tell anyone else. In fact, I think it's a good idea to be careful about who you tell about your wins, because that can engender envy, and that's not helpful. You don't need to make it a two-person dynamic. You can celebrate your own successes. And if you get into the practice of doing that, then when you are in a situation, say at work, where it might be helpful to put yourself forward and say, I have a lot of strengths, or I've really accomplished a lot, it'll flow more easily because you've really metabolized it and let it become a part of you.
There's a lot of goodness in there. I want to reflect a few things back. You were talking about being discerning with our responses. And I think in the book, you refer to it as having a full palette for painting versus just a few colors. And I
Yeah.
think that takes practice. It was taking me back to when I was in, boardrooms in my 20s, and I would have an idea and I'd kind of, it drives me absolutely insane that I did this, but I would say, I don't know, but I was thinking, and I would discredit myself.
Yes.
And I've forgiven that version of myself, but I think just practicing standing in our power and having other choices. I love the word that you said, conscious, because when we practice and being conscious about what we're choosing, it's like we don't go into that default mode automatically. So I just wanted to say I appreciate that. And then I really love the distinction you're making about celebrating our wins. I think a lot of women are self deprecating
Yes.
and just can't take a win sometimes or
Mhm.
accept a compliment. And I like that invitation to make it a private practice. Like, you don't need to be boastful. You want to celebrate, have some, champagne with friends, go for it. But I love that it's just a personal, just collection of worthiness and feel good. I really like that idea. So thank you for sharing something practical we can try too.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's surprising that it's hard for us to let ourselves sort of rest and have our thoughts rest on our wins when we have something nice happen to us. It almost feels like, oh, that's not allowed. But it's fine. Go ahead. Let yourself bask in it internally. And you can share it carefully with others that you trust. But
Yeah. I think
it's
we could
more
all
powerful, I think, to take it in than it is to say put it on social media and wait for the likes, because that complicates the process.
Yeah, and we have enough going on. I feel like that idea, science-backed idea of positive rumination, you might be having a rough day, pull out your booklet. Why not? Show up for yourself, meet your
Yeah.
own needs. I know that one of the qualities you talk about is shrewdness, and shrew historically has been used to describe a woman who is sharp-tongued, unsavory, difficult. But I would like you to talk into that call for female shrewdness and why this made the outlaw list, because I think it's a word for some women that makes them lean back.
Yes. I mean, so both the term like shrew as an insult and the term shrewd actually come from this little mammal. But shrewd, it is a bit of an ambivalent word, but it implies being sharp, canny, street smart, really knowing what's up. And I think that a lot of times, one of the things that can happen is we want to be trusting, we want to assume the best of everyone. And so we deny what we actually know about a situation. And that can get us into trouble, and that can actually be dangerous. So I have an anecdote from when I think I was 11 years old, and I have this anecdote about how I got this new ring, and it was this ring I'd saved up for. It was this silver puzzle ring, and I was so pleased with it. And I went over to this older girl's house, and I was so happy to be, with these older girls, and I felt kind of in awe of them a little bit. And the one girl said, "Oh, can I see your ring? Can you give it to me for a minute?" And I took it off and I gave it to her. And I was so excited that she was interested in something that was mine. And she went off into her room and she didn't come back with the ring. And when it was time to go, I said, "Can I have my ring?" And she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I just sort of went along with it. I sort of, like, a part of me knew that she had just stolen my ring from me, but another part of me was like, "Oh, well, what happened there?" I let myself be kind of seduced into sort of like a not knowing place. And I think a lot of times as women, we can do that. And in much worse ways. I mean, I think I tell this story in the book too. A young woman who she was kind of accosted. She was approached rather aggressively by a man in a public park. And he wanted to talk to her and get her number. And she kept on saying, "No, thank you." And I said to her, I said, "Did you think about saying, leave me the fuck alone?" She said, "Well, I didn't want to be rude." So that speaks both to the desire to be agreeable, but also a little bit of this kind of naivete. I mean, you need to not forget that the world can be a nasty place. And it's okay for you to be shrewd, to know that not everyone out there, whether it's the older girl down the street or the guy in the park, has your best interest at heart. You would be doing a disservice to yourself not to be shrewd about those things, not to lose your innocence complex, as I refer to it in the book.
Hey y'all, it's Whitney Baker just popping in here for a moment. Summer break is either here or it's just around the corner for many of us moms. And I know that brings a mix of joy and excitement, but also maybe a sense of chaos. We want to be present, we want to have fun, but it's not like life just pauses for us. That's why I want to make sure you know about my $37 program called 5 Days to Less Stress, More Satisfaction. It's an intentionally short, easy to digest, self-guided program that helps you start your mornings with just a little bit of time dedicated to yourself. So you feel more grounded, more clear, and like you're consciously choosing to pour into yourself and better equipped to show up how you want during these summer days. Whether you're working inside or outside the home, summer usually includes lots of transitions. And I know as moms, we work hard to make sure that our kids are making memories and having all of these fun experiences. But there can be this feeling like we're putting so much effort into everybody else that we forget that we get to enjoy summer too. So this program is an invitation for you to pour into yourself. This is a guided meditation-based program, so it's also great for all of you guys who've heard all of the science and all of the insights about how beneficial meditating can be, but you're having trouble establishing a regular practice or you just don't know where to start. When you buy this program for just $37, you will have 5 lovingly crafted themed guided meditations that you can enjoy, along with journaling prompts to take your self-connection deeper, and a fun, actionable step that you can take each day to continue to show up for yourself. Once you buy 5 Days to Less Stress, More Satisfaction, these tools are yours to keep. If you're ready to feel self-supportive and self-loyal and show up for yourself this summer, 5 Days to Less Stress, More Satisfaction is a click away in the show notes, or you can connect with me on Instagram at @WhitneyWoman. You're welcome to message me there with any questions. Okay, back to the show. Yeah, Lisa, I want you to give us some language here because sometimes we literally need the words. I think this happens oftentimes for women when they're getting male attention for their physical appearance and it's unwelcome, unwanted, but they're so uncomfortable with the possibility of making the man uncomfortable, especially in a public setting, that they just kind of demur and, laugh it off. And that can be very uncomfortable. So I'm wondering if you could give us some examples of what you would coach someone to do in that circumstance.
I mean, I do think it depends. I think if it's your boss, say, at a company party, that might require one response that you might have to invoke trickster energy for that situation. But if you're in a public place and someone is behaving inappropriately, I think there's nothing wrong with saying, "Leave me alone." Just very declarative and straightforward and even loud and direct.
Yeah, I like it. You brought up the trickster energy, and I have to say that is one that I was actually surprised kind of tripped me up because I grew up in Iowa. It was the
Mhm.
land of like head down to the grindstone. Hard work is put on a huge pedestal. And I had to notice what was bubbling up a little bit of like, well, it feels bad to get a shortcut if everyone else is working hard and that sort of thing. And then I was like, wow, that's in my mind still.
Yeah, yeah.
So you encourage women to reclaim this trickster energy, and it's eye opening, maybe somewhere I still have work to do. Can you speak into that?
Yeah, I think it can lock us up a little bit if we can't sort of think creatively and out of the box and a little bit transgressively. Like, is there a shortcut? Is there a way to get this done faster and easier? And if there is, and it's legitimate, I mean, I'm not talking about like using ChatGPT to write your paper, but opening yourself up to a kind of creative response that you maybe didn't imagine if you're just so focused on it's got to be really hard work. But also, trickster energy can come in tremendously handy when we're in situations in which we truly don't have power. I mean, I think there are a lot of stories of, kind of female trickster stories where the heroine is beset. She's in danger, she's about to be harmed or captured, and she evades it through a trick. And I think the fact that there are so many of these stories really speaks to the fact that, women are factually less physically strong. The majority of women are less physically strong than the majority of men. And so we are in danger of male violence. Most violence that is committed against women is committed by men. I'm not saying that all men are violent, but this is a statistic. We do have to be aware of that. I remember once being with a friend in a town in France and we were being followed. And I mean, luckily nothing happened, but I was certainly aware that if they approached us, that we were likely not, I'm not a great fighter. I'm not a big person. And certainly I was racking my brains for tricks. How can we be tricky and get our way out of this? And I think women have traditionally had to do that. Someone said to me once, "Well, I would never want my daughter to learn to be tricky because you're talking about being manipulative." And I said, "Well, I hope I've taught my daughter to be tricky because it can save your life."
Yeah, this definitely brought up some reflection for me. I have two daughters, and just in terms of how I talk to them, because it's definitely easier to parent someone who wants to follow the rules or do what they're told. But I'm almost more concerned with some of those traits I tell my husband than, no, I'm not doing that. I'm really conscious as a parent about how I talk to my daughters about that. And we're going through a scenario now where my oldest daughter, who's in junior high, manages to leave what seems late for school almost every single day, but somehow she doesn't get counted tardy. And she loves it and she takes her time and she's unrushed in the morning. And I spent time being frustrated about it. And I'm like, especially after reading this book, I'm like, she's kind of a trickster. And I don't want to teach her out of that or scold that. And so I'm curious if you have advice for parents and how to not take some of these outlaw qualities and make them bad in our kids.
Wow, that is such an interesting question. And I want to say, like, yeah, that's a dilemma with your kid, right? Because you'd like for her to leave home knowing the importance of being on time and that sort of thing. The one thing I want to say is that the whole book is actually a little bit of a meditation on what Jung called the shadow. And Jung said, we all have a shadow. We develop our shadow in the course of childhood and adolescence as we learn what qualities are valued by the culture and by our parents and caregivers and teachers, which ones are not allowed. And it's sort of necessary that we learn that certain qualities are bad. You and I both know those parents who don't say, like, actually, you shouldn't hit other kids, And it's like those kids are a nightmare. They're not set up for success because they don't know the rules. It's almost like you have to learn the rules first, and then later in life, you can learn to break them. But I appreciate the subtlety of the situation that you're talking about because your daughter's in early adolescence, which is a time that we experiment with things. And, in a way, we're all going to wind up having pieces of us kind of lopped off by the time we get to an adulthood. And really, my book is about how do you reclaim those, not
Mhm.
how do you avoid getting them lopped off in the first place. But in a situation like you're describing with your daughter, you can sort of appreciate what she's learned that's working for her and maybe help her get to adulthood without too much shame about it or with maybe a slightly broader repertoire of choices. So let me put it to you another way. If your daughter doesn't know how to be on time, that's a problem.
Right.
She knows when she can cut corners and be a little late, but she also knows how to show up on time. That's great. Because then there's that discernment and that choice again. So we want to put as much as possible in the realm of choice. And for a young person, sometimes that's too much. They can't choose. We just have to say, no, you need to learn how to be on time. But if she already has that, I mean, my son, I think, kind of fits in this category. He was like the king of, I get my homework done at breaks during school, and then I come home and I don't have to do homework. And he was like a solid student, but he wasn't like top of his class. And I used to be like, oh, if you could just like a little more elbow grease, maybe bring those grades up a little bit. But he was like, why? This is good enough. And then I have my afternoon. And that was a little hard to argue with. Like,
Yeah.
an A minus. It's like, okay, like, really, mom? And I have to say that, although there is a part of me that wishes he was like that person who was like, no, it has to be perfect. I have to get an A plus. There's something to be said for I'm going to work smarter, not harder,
Yeah, it's nuanced. I appreciate that reflection. I want to make sure that we also talk about your invitation to just straight up be disagreeable. We are not taught that as a savory quality for any woman who wants to be liked. It's part of human to want to belong, but I think women especially just put such pressure on ourselves to be likable. Can you tell us about just that quick story about your friend Terry who kind of shut it down at a dinner party and why that wasn't an important moment for you?
Yeah, it was so great. Yes, I was probably like in my early 30s and I was working overseas and Terry was probably my age now. She was probably around 60 and she loved to cook and have dinner parties. And she would invite us all over. And she had this great apartment that had this like rooftop that looked over the bay. It was really beautiful. So she would make this great food. And the first time that I went, we're out there, we're on the roof, there's music playing, we're under the stars, we're having a glass of wine, we're finishing up dessert. And she comes upstairs, she goes, okay, I'm going to go to bed. So you need to leave now. And I was like, what? I was so floored. It felt so awkward. I was like, it was just very strange. But I was thinking about it afterwards, like, that's awesome. Because I mean, I had already at that point in my life thrown my share of parties where by the end of the night I was like, oh, please go. I have to go to sleep, but I was too nice to say anything. So I love the example that Terry set where, I want to invite you into my home. I love having you. I want to feed you and host you. And then I want you gone when I'm ready to go to bed.
Yeah. Well, and I think that sometimes when you're willing to just be clear about your needs, then
Mhm.
people really trust you.
Right. It's so great. It's so refreshing to sort of just feel like it's all straightforward. By the way, I
Yeah.
suspect that's very American and that there are probably many Europeans and perhaps Brits in particular who would just never be able to do that kind of culturally. But it's even hard for us as American women. But I think we all can feel the relief that you're referring to when someone is just clear.
Yes. I found one other section of your book, something that I feel like comes up. It's common for many women to have brush ups with their mother in law in some way. And I feel like oftentimes it's just a lack of clear communication, kind of what we're talking about. But in the book, you explore a little bit about how we are culturally taught to be deferential to older generations. And I think that is a tough place to thread the needle of being kind, like you said, but also standing up for what's right for our families, what we do or don't want to do. Can you share some perspective on that and also how we might stand in our power when it comes to making choices for our own time and our own families, when it comes to maybe grandparents, even?
I suspect that mother in law, daughter in law relationships, the difficulty around them is probably deeply archetypal. I would love to hear an anthropological discussion of that because I suspect that anthropologists who have studied like kinship structures and that kind of thing probably have something to say about this. And I imagine it may even manifest at times in indigenous cultures. So I think it goes very deep. And of course, there is a cultural component to it. I absolutely loved that television show, Everybody Loves Raymond. The heat between the daughter in law and the mother in law in that show was hilarious and incredibly, I thought, sort of spot on psychologically. So it's something a lot of us relate to in one way or another. And I think that's because it's right at that edge where the younger woman is trying to assume and experience her own authority. For the first time, she might be the head of her own household or the mother of her child. And here's this older woman who's done it before. I think part of the shadow of being the mother in law, and I'm sure that I will wrestle with this when it's my turn. Hopefully, I'll get a turn at that, I hope, is that the older woman is waning. Her authority, her influence, her power is on the decline. And that's a hard thing. We don't want to let that go. Here's this young upstart who doesn't know what she's doing. So, we as the older woman want to move in, maybe with all good intentions, and just say, why don't you do this? Or why don't you do it like that? Or when I was your age, I was doing this. It is the rare kind of older woman who can say, this is your baby. You need to learn how to do it the way you want. Or this is your Christmas. How do you want to design it? I think it's very human on both sides. The younger woman can feel really affronted. The older woman can feel hurt. There's lots of room for just stepping on each other's toes as the generations march forward. But one of the kind of takeaways for me there's a story I tell in the book about this young woman that I worked with and just her feeling really upset about it. And then she recognized that actually she held all the power. And once she knew that, she could actually soften toward her mother in law while claiming that power. Like, if you know that you've got the power, you don't need to be nasty. No, and what I mean by she had the power is she was married to this woman's son. She had this woman's grandchildren. What was the mother in law actually going to do? She really was in the position of power. And when I said that to her, it came as a shock. She said, what do you mean? And I sort of explained it just as I explained it now. And she was taken aback. And once she could really metabolize that, she could kind of sit into that power and authority. And then she could turn to treat her mother-in-law, who is an incredibly accomplished, intelligent person, with a lot of respect and kindness and warmth, never forgetting for a second that she was the one who had the power.
Yeah, I feel like that brings us full circle back to having that conscious choice with a lot of awareness of the situation, but choosing to kind of soften the relationship instead of having to prove herself. I'm curious, if somebody was to read The Vital Spark, what's one message you would feel really good about them taking away?
You're allowed to develop these other parts of yourself that you might have been told were dangerous or unsavory or not allowed. That you are allowed to develop these and that your life will be bigger for it.
Yeah. And I would just like to add that a lot of your client examples, it seems to be women in middle age who almost have that feeling of like, who am I anymore? It's too late. And I feel like you probably would, I would assume, say it's not never to reclaim these
No.
energies.
Midlife is a great time. Midlife is a
Ye-
great time. I have some clients in my 20s that I feel like found this material useful, but yeah, it's always there for you.
I always like to end my episodes with an opportunity for reflection. So, in this area of reclaiming our outlaw energies and finding this kind of feisty feminine core that we all probably can fine tune, what's one question women could be asking themselves?
I think it might be, where am I keeping myself small?
Love that. Awesome. Lisa, this was great. I know my community is going to want to learn more about The Vital Spark and your other books. Where can we find you and follow you and support your work?
My author website is lisamarchiano.com, and you can find out more about my other books there. And you can also find out about my online fairy tale group for women, which is called Spinning Straw. And that's a really great community too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you joined me today. If you're looking for more, feel free to connect with me on Instagram at @WhitneyWoman. And if you enjoyed the show, I invite you to support me by leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. Hope you have an inspired day.